In the course of their research into causes of infant deaths, Nam, Eberstein, and Deeb had to deal with a peculiar problem emerging from their data from death certificates. Among all the other specific causes reported as codes from the International Classification of Diseases, they encountered one such code in particular that did not actually identify any cause of death. Instead, it was a diagnosis of exclusion. That cause was labeled SIDS, or Sudden Unexplained Infant Death. The SIDS label had been proposed by Dr. J. Bruce Beckwith, a pediatric pathologist, at a 1969 Seattle conference on sudden infant death. The work of medical examiners and other experts led the U.S. National Center for Health Statistics to add a provisional SIDS code of 795 to the then current 8th revision of the ICD in 1973. 6 years later, when the new 9th revision of the ICD was adopted by the World Health Organization for international use, it included a new code of 798 for SIDS. This opened the door for infant deaths that otherwise might have been attributed to other causes or relegated to the catch-all category of cause unknown to be recorded on death certificates with the new SIDS diagnosis. Cases of unexplained infant deaths have a long history, reported in ancient texts including the Bible and called crib death and many other things, as ably summarized in James Wright's 2017 review of the history of SIDS. Such a diagnosis is deeply unsatisfying to both medical professionals and health researchers, and Nam and his colleagues were no exception. SIDS deaths reported on the Florida death certificates used for this article were diagnosed after the fact of the actual death. The actual deaths usually were not observed or witnessed by anyone, not by parents or other caretakers, and not by any healthcare workers, because these infants had not given any warning that they might be in trouble. Dr. Larry Deeb describes the typical story encountered by medical practitioners when faced with an event that would end up with a SIDS ICD code on a death certificate.
And so it's a baby found dead. Typically, go down for a nap, usually wakes up in an hour, doesn't wake up. And it's usually an absolutely perfectly healthy baby. It's bubbling and happy and doing all the things they're supposed to do in the first 6 months of life and didn't wake up.
As Nam, Eberstein, and Deeb considered their evidence from Florida vital statistics for the early 1980s, they were confronted with a substantial fraction, about 11% of all infant deaths that appeared with the ICD-9 code of 798 for SIDS. This would be troubling enough when you remember that we're talking about an admission that nobody knows what caused the death, but the problem was actually much more serious. Almost all SIDS deaths were reported long after babies had gone home with their families, sometime during the post-neonatal period from the 2nd through the 11th months following birth. If we consider post-neonatal deaths separately, 3 of every 10 such deaths in the Florida data received the SIDS diagnosis, a situation that proved intolerable to the researchers and led them to prepare this article. A serious debate already existed between scholars who tried to explain SIDS deaths as a result of many different possible organic problems going on inside infants, and others who suspected that some kind of external environmental factors might be involved. Co-investigator Ike Eberstein explains how this ongoing debate helped them to frame this research.
Remember, what we were trying to do was to compare a biological medical interpretation of SIDS. That is, it's something that just happens biologically. I mean, something fails, and there's no outside influence, with a model that says, no, there's outside influence, and it works through medical conditions, of course, because it's a biological event, a medical event, but the causes are external. So what we were trying to do is use the data we had and say, okay, we know that accidents are external, right? They're by definition come from, and we know that congenital malformations are by definition internal. And so these were the examples of the extremes. And so we said, okay, now we got these two extremes. Let's look at the moms and see who they're closest to for SIDS. And that was the whole methodology in the paper.
Nam, Eberstein, and Deeb already were linking social characteristics to other causes of death more generally in their larger NICHD project. They hoped that this look at social context might also give them the leverage they needed to choose between internal and external etiologies for sudden unexplained infant deaths. After conducting their statistical analysis, they successfully identified 3 social factors in particular that helped them to answer the question. Comparing women who dropped out of high school to those who graduated and to those who went on to college showed a very steep gradient of falling risks of both accidental and SIDS infant deaths with more education. Infant deaths from congenital anomalies, however, showed very little of this contrast by mother's education. Similarly, risks of both accidental and SIDS deaths were much higher among black mothers, but much lower among Hispanic mothers than among the non-Hispanic white comparison group. Again, these ethnic differences were much less noticeable for deaths from congenital anomalies. Finally, the highest risks for both accidental and SIDS infant deaths appeared among the youngest teenage mothers, falling nearly linearly with increasing maternal age. In contrast, infant deaths from congenital anomalies were lowest for the youngest mothers and increased linearly with maternal age instead of decreasing. The verdict from this research seemed crystal clear. Whatever was behind these SIDS deaths, the social patterns in their occurrence looked very much like the pattern for deaths attributed to external accidental causes, and quite unlike the pattern for internal congenital causes. In the 3 decades that have elapsed since publication of this article, sudden unexplained infant deaths declined dramatically. In particular, one simple change that appeared almost immediately after this article led to an immediate drop in SIDS diagnoses. The medical and public health communities launched a campaign in the early 1990s called Back to Sleep, urging mothers and other caregivers to place their vulnerable infants on their backs when it was time to sleep, not to lay them face down on their stomachs.
And you know what happened in 1990, 92, 94?
Back to sleep.
Sleep on your back.
What happened?
Sleep on your back. The most mothers fought it tooth and nail. What do you mean? Put him on his back.
Caused a lot of grief between grandmothers and mothers over babies.
But there's the curve. I mean, it's like a brick fell on it. And when you go back in history, and do this up in a kid and put him on his stomach, his nose would be in the dirt. So they were sleeping on their backs.
This simple advice, despite some early resistance from caregivers not accustomed to the idea, quickly caught on, and a substantial share of SIDS deaths ceased to show up in vital statistics over the 1990s. On the other hand, since the start of the new century after 2000, more problematic infant deaths gradually have begun to be labeled as accidents due to suffocation and related problems, partly also accounting for the continued decline in the use of the SIDS diagnosis on death certificates. For medical and health researchers who like to know what is causing the tragic loss of any infant who dies, this gradual erosion of the SIDS diagnosis may point to a better informed future for parents and children as well as for the researchers themselves.